Hello everybody and welcome back. So very excited now. We are going to be diving into our first pipeline tool. This is where it is going to get seriously advanced, really cool. We're going to take everything we've learned up to now and combine it all, push ourselves, challenge what we've learned. So this is fantastic. So I'm going to show you the first tool. Now, obviously, when we're building tools from scratch, we don't really have something to demo. We have to kind of use our imagination, think about what we're going to be creating and list it, as I've said before. So we spoke about, kind of how to get your mind wrapped around the creation of tools and, thinking about the user and everything like that. But in this case, because obviously to do this course, I've already designed the tool, I want to just kind of show you what the tool does. And then we're going to work backwards. We're going to sort of, dissect what it does and then go and rebuild it. And at first, especially if you're newer to scripting, that might be a good thing to do to practice. So you actually go and find some cool tools and scripts that already exist and then try to recreate them. But in future, what you're doing is actually recreating what you've imagined the tool to do instead of what it, a tool that already exists. Okay, so let me drop one down and we're going to talk about it. So the scene data node, this is the first thing we're going to be building for our pipeline. Okay, essentially what we want to do when we're working with our projects and our pipeline is to be able to select different projects. We need to keep projects separate from one another. We might need to keep certain HDAs totally separate. So, work for one client uses a bunch of HDAs, work for another client maybe does not use those same HDAs, because you do not want to accidentally sort of cross your work over. Okay, certain HDAs, of course, will be your own tools, things that the client has no kind of say over, and so you can put that in your global area and you can just use those HDAs. That's totally fine. But if you, for example, create an asset for a client, you cannot use that same asset for another client unless it is specified in your contract or whatever. So you need to be very careful about these things. And that's why if you've got your own freelance pipeline, you're sort of working on your own personal projects or whatever, or you're a remote artist, you need to sort of think about these things. As well as obviously if you're going to maybe be starting your own studio and sort of building it up, this is obviously a good place to start, is figuring out your actual pipeline and how you're going to keep certain data separate and some data combined. So we want to be able to set which project we're working in, and our entire scene needs to know that. So we want to use variables like environment variables and things like that, so that anything in our scene, for example, reading our caches, knows which folder to look in for the right caches because it knows which project we're working in. What about your FPS? Certain projects are on a different FPS. Like you might be working at 30 frames a second, you might be working at 25 or 24. So, that is project specific. And then within the project as well, you're going to have different scenes. So those scenes might be, it might be an actual sort of story, so a short film or a cinematic or something like that. So then you'll have these different scenes. But even if it's just a one-off project, you still want a scene to use, because maybe you'll have like a test scene or like a dev area within that project. So you have these almost sub areas, okay, which we're going to call scenes. So choosing a project and choosing a scene, and based on that information, having a bunch of environment variables set so that everything in our scene can reference using these variables. And of course, if we then have a render farm, our render farm can use those same variables, even though things might be, exist in a different location. That location is relative to the variable. Okay, so let's just explore what this node can do, and then we're going to go back and build it up. Right. So here I have a list of projects. Okay. So what's important to note as well is the kind of user functionality of this node. Okay. At first your tools are going to basically be quite raw. Whenever you develop tools straight away, they're very finicky. There's like a very specific way you need to work with them, or certain errors will pop up, but you know those errors, so you just click past them. But as you sort of refine the tool and it's ready for use, it needs to go through a process where you make sure that it's user-friendly. So one of them is the fact that when I drop this down, if it doesn't detect that I'm in any sort of scene, so it knows I don't have these variables set, it's going to default to a sort of a null project. Okay, so we need to have that in the list, first of all, as an option. We cannot just have our project, because what if a new user drops it down and they have no project set? Then they will have errors. And these types of errors are one of the most difficult to stop, because in developing the tool, you obviously have a bunch of projects set up. And so it's very hard to kind of have that foresight to think about a person using it for the very first time, where certain things are not set. And a lot of the times you won't even test for that and build something into your script to account for it, because you know you've already got a bunch of projects here. You don't even think that far ahead. So it is very important to take some time, almost step back from the node for a while, or the tool, and kind of think, what would a brand new user do with this? Or if you have someone new, that is even better. You should test your tool, like actually take it to someone else, brand new, totally different machine, and they don't even know how to use the node. Give it to them and don't say anything, and let them use it and see what they do. Look at where they click first, and take notes and build your scene based on what the user is going to do, right? So these are all things we've discussed. Okay, so basically I have a null project if I have nothing set, right? But I can select from a bunch of projects that I've already created. Okay, so like here's our Rebel Way Python script. So I created this project area for this course, but I also have a dev area which lives in an entirely different area, and then I've got a test project here. Okay, and of course you're going to create a lot of test projects and things when you're creating pipeline tools, so you'll have a bunch of empty projects, because you need to be able to create these and delete them. Right, so you'll see when I select a project that exists, the scene over here, which was disabled, now becomes enabled, and it goes and sets a bit of information. Not all of the information, just the information under project. It's got a project name. Okay, it has a code, it has a frames per second value, right? And then it has a bunch of path variables as well. So a project path, so that's to the raw actual the root project. So over here, you'll see we already have done some work in this. Remember, we were creating the when we were talking about the OS module, so we could probably clean that up. But so it knows where the root of the actual project exists. It knows where the scenes for that exist. It has its own HDA folder, okay, which will then, okay, well, it hasn't created it yet, but it will when we initialize the scene, okay, and then scripts as well. So it can have its own HDAs and its own scripts. This is where you would keep not your global HDAs and global scripts, but ones that are project specific. Okay. Now, what it does is it allows me to click down this drop down menu, and it shows me a bunch of scenes that I already have created. Okay, so this one already exists, so it's detecting it first and putting it in a list, which is one function that we need to build. When we select the scene, it sets the scene data. So there's our scene variable and our save path, output path, cache path, and render path. Okay, so these are things that we need to do. We obviously need to save our scene somewhere. We need to have an output path which has sub paths, so caches and renders. Okay, I mean this is all I've kept it really basic, and this is all I've thought of for now, but your pipeline may be different, and you may want something else inside of the output path, or you may want an entirely different scene path as well. You've got your save and your output, but you might have something else, so you can always just add to this. So it has a whole bunch of variables that are set. Okay, now these are parameters that have that full path, right? But it's actually getting an environment variable, And so really what the script is doing is actually setting these environment variables. So let's come and have a look in here. We'll see that we have project path, proj FPS, save path, scenes path. So these are all the variables that we're setting over here, okay, which means we can now refer to them using, and in fact I've even named my parameters that way to try and hint to the user how it should be used. $code will return test01, $proj FPS will return 30, okay. So that's how this works. Some other features to this include the fact that I can now add and remove new projects, right? So I can add a new project and we can go, all right, in here we're going to choose where we're going to save our project, and we're going to create a folder for it. So we're going to say, okay, this is going to be my new test, okay. So I create that and I select this folder and say, okay, this is where I want my new project to live. And when we do that, it pops up asking us a bunch of information. So it's automatically going to populate the project name with what we named the folder, but we might want to call it something different, maybe give it some spaces and capital letters or do whatever, or it can be an entirely different name, okay? Which is very important. See, we don't need it to have that number like 04 or whatever, but in our folder structure we might want that because maybe we want to keep our projects ordered in terms of when we got them. Okay, makes it a lot easier when you've got a massive amount of projects over years of work that actually at the end are all of your most recent projects. But you know, you obviously want, so then you want to attach a number to the project, the folder, but not to the project name, because the name is just the name. Okay, you don't want to every time have to remember that this project was 098 new test. You know, like it just much easier to just have a name for the project, but then the folder is different. So that's why we've built it this way, where we can keep those two separate. We also have a project code, so we could call this just new or whatever. The reason for a project code, right? I mean, this is just different for every pipeline, but sometimes you want a sort of it's almost a short form way of referring to this project name, because the project name might have capital letters, underscores, or spaces, a combination of different characters as a sort of more descriptive, longer name for what this project actually is. But sometimes when you're writing your, let's say you write out a cache, you don't necessarily want the project name embedded in the cache when the project name is a much more descriptive, long name. But you kind of want your caches tagged with whatever project they're for. So we will use a code, which is kind of like a short way of saying this project, okay? So then if we created another test project, we could call it literally another test project or whatever, but then in the code, we would call it test02, okay? Much easier way to kind of link all these projects together. Or you could have projects that have very, very different names. You know, like some, even like movies, they have sequels, but the sequel is not just, you know, it's not just Lord of the Rings 1 and Lord of the Rings 2. No, it's got its own name, you know. And so the code might be a way of linking those two projects. So it would just be LOTR1, LOTR2, but then the actual name is, you know, the Fellowship of the Ring and, you know, the Two Towers and whatever. And that's the actual project name, okay? So there's multiple reasons for having a project code. If you don't want that in your pipeline, of course, you don't need to use this, but it's just my recommendation. And I've done something like this at many different studios, so it is quite a common thing to do. And then, of course, your FPS is a very important thing on every project. And a lot of the time there's some confusion because some clients in different countries, they want different things. The format, the output format is different. So you need to be very careful of what your FPS is, very deliberate about that, and make sure that all your scenes are set up correctly. So you want to build a pipeline where if you've got multiple artists working for you, if you maybe start a small studio, and then your FPS is set by the project in some procedural way. So when they open up a new scene and set their scene data to this project, they don't have to remember every time to go and set the FPS to 25 when maybe your default in Houdini is 30. Okay, so we say okay here, and then it creates that new test project in our list. You see it is already populated in here. If I click on new test, it then sets itself. It's got 25 FPS, it's got the code, it's got the project, and it's gone and set the folders for me. Okay. And then scenes. Now with the scenes, we do not have sort of an add and remove. We could do that if that's the case. You could actually deliberately add or remove scenes. But in this case, I just built it a slightly different way. You can obviously decide which way you would like the most. But here what I did is I just said, if there is nothing in the list, or the one that you're looking for is not in the list, if you type something new that it doesn't find, it's going to create it. Well, it's going to ask you first. So let's say, let's just call it test scene. Okay. And then when we hit enter, it pops up saying the scene folder test scene does not exist. Do you want to create this folder now? Okay. So we can say yes or no. Right? And you see, no is an option. We need to always be able to cancel what we're doing if the user doesn't know what they've done. Okay. So in this case, we're going to say, yeah, sure, go create it. It also prints a bunch of information here saying, hey, I created the save path, I created the output path, I created the cache path and the render path. So it's giving me information in my actual terminal as well. It's printing stuff and telling me what it's doing rather than just making assumptions. Okay. And then over here, it has then set my scene and my save path, output path, everything like that. Okay. It also on the node, so it has a strange color, which I've maybe, I've chosen this purple thing because it kind of, it reminds me of the purple and the Python stuff. So when I see that, it just makes me think of sort of pipeline stuff. So I've chosen that color specifically so that in your scene while you're working, you can see which are your nodes that are like, important pipeline nodes versus your normal, geonodes. I've also given it a strange shape. Personally, I just like this circle because it stands out to me as being odd and doesn't look like the normal nodes that we use. So it also, to me, feels like it's sort of like a hub with data and information as opposed to a normal node in the scene. And then I've got the display and selectability set off so that it doesn't display in the scene. It's an empty null, so it has nothing in it. Sorry, an empty subnet. And it sets a comment with the the project name and the scene name. Okay, you'll see if we go and create a new scene, then it goes and sets the comment like that already there. Okay, and again, it's going to go and create that. So now we have this list of different scenes that we've created in here, so we can swap back and forward between test scene and new scene. And when we do, changes some of our variables, but obviously not our project variables. And then if we switch between projects, so go to my dev area, now that's in an entirely different place. I currently have no scenes set up for this. Well, I haven't selected a scene, so I can now go and select a test scene from there. And so here we can essentially navigate our projects. Okay, within one scene, we can now go and say, okay, we're going to go there, choose our new scene. So now we're in the right location, right scene, and all our data is set. So now everything, our animation caches and everything are all based on this one node. Okay. So this is what we're trying to build, right? And as I've said before, you want to break down what it is that the user actually wants out of it, how they would work with it, what it's meant to do. You want to be very clear and logical about that, so that when we go into it, we have a goal and we know what to develop. Right. So we are going to be recreating this node, and I look forward to doing it with you all.